Hi, I'm Jonny. Welcome back to Bork. Today we'll be talking about nukes and specifically nuclear energy. I don't know how much you know about nuclear energy, but currently it contributes around 10% of the world's energy supply, which isn't actually a massive proportion, but significant obviously. Basically it works by using uranium as its fuel. So all of the ways that we produce power and electricity to run our houses, our schools, the world we live in basically, everything requires an input of some kind, whether that's renewable energy using the wind or the sun, or gas and coal or oil-fired generation, so that's power stations that use those fossil fuels. They have that as a fuel input. But nuclear power stations actually use uranium, which is this kind of weird radioactive substance that we find under the ground in our planet. So you use we basically mine it, so we take it out of the ground, we turn that into small hard pellets that we then put into long steel rods. We fill that stuff up with the uranium and then we put those rods into the core of the reactor of a nuclear power plant. In TV and movies you might have actually seen what these nuclear reactor rods look like. So on The Simpsons you've got the glowing green one that's bouncing around and sticking to the back of people's shirts and probably causing all of your favourite characters cancer. So there's that one if you've seen The Simpsons, and then you know, they're in lots of other films as well. There's one where James Bond, there's a bald guy that can't feel pain and James Bond stabs him with the reactor core, and lots of other things in popular culture. So you probably recognise those reactor rods. Process that actually happens in nuclear power stations to generate the energy is called fission, and that is where the uranium fuel in those reactor tubes undergoes a chemical reaction and it's actually split, which generates heat. Heat's a bit of a recurring theme in power stations because most of the time, there are exceptions obviously, but most of the time heat is used in some way to basically turn water into steam, which then goes up and goes through turbines which spin, and that's used to actually create the electricity. So a lot of the time when we picture nuclear power stations, the image that everyone has in their head is kind of the cooling towers, where they're these like egg timer looking things. And that is where, you know, you see a lot of people think there's lots of smoke pouring out the top of them. Fun fact for you all out there, it's not actually smoke, that's just the steam that's being produced. So nuclear energy, that's basically how it works, but as I'm sure you know already, it's extremely controversial. So you've got one side of people basically saying that it's the worst thing we can do for the environment, because it creates, although it is just steam going into the atmosphere, it does create radioactive waste that's left behind. So lots of people say that nuclear energy is actually, you know, we're poisoning the planet, we should avoid doing it at all costs, it's the worst thing ever and we should stay well away from it. On the other side, you have people saying that nuclear energy is actually cleaner, and you know, their point of view is that it's replacing carbon dioxide emissions because it's replacing fossil fuel fired factories like oil, gas and coal generation. So there's actually less carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere if a nuclear power plant replaces a coal one, for instance. So according to NASA, the famous space agency, since 1976, around 64 gigatons of carbon dioxide have actually been avoided from going into the atmosphere because of nuclear energy, according to them. And that is because these power stations have directly replaced coal power stations. So whatever you argue, whatever your opinions are about the waste they might actually end up producing as well, in terms of carbon dioxide, which is, you know, the main contributor to human-caused climate change, if you believe the 99.9% of scientists that say that, then, you know, nuclear energy is actually helping solve the issue of climate change and global warming because it's not contributing to this, all of these greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So there are good sides and bad sides to nuclear power, as there is with anything. But I'm going to start with the bad stuff first for us. So with nuclear energy, even though there's no actual greenhouse gas emissions that it's causing, there is lots of nuclear waste that it produces. So that's radioactive sludge basically, and radioactive other things that end up left behind after we've generated the energy. So everyone's got this image of nuclear waste given to us by mass media and popular culture, as I was saying earlier, where things are glowing green and they're unhealthy and creating mutant animals. And actually on this subject, The Simpsons predicted what could happen in the future. So there's a fish called Blinky that Bart finds, I believe, in one of The Simpsons episodes, and it's got 3 eyes. I think it's bright blue or pink or something like that. And it's pretty mutated, doesn't look anything like a normal fish. And that's because of the famous Springfield nuclear power station that Homer Simpson works in has actually caused that by pumping waste into this waterway. So a decade later in Argentina, a fish like this was actually found. Don't know if it was pink or blue, like I said, but this fish had 3 eyes. It was swimming around in a reservoir in Argentina, and the water that went into this reservoir was actually part of the runoff from a nuclear power station. So I don't think it was conclusively proved whether that was a cause of that either way, but it seems a bit suspicious to me. I wouldn't be eating it. Nothing's ever perfect and things do go wrong. So like anything, nuclear energy sometimes has its mistakes and catastrophes happen. So in the last 60 years, there's been about 7 actual serious nuclear power station incidents around the world. So out of these 7 events that happened in the last 60 years, 4 of those actually released significant amounts of radiation into the surrounding area. So that's carried in the air and carried on the wind. So if you're downwind of that, you're probably going to have a pretty bad time where, you know, for generations that can actually affect you and the health of your children. It can make fields and farms and crops unable to grow and unfertile. It can kill wildlife. It can create a whole range of medical issues. Just in the early years, they've continued right through really from the 70s until now. And although they're rare, they can be quite serious. So we've got Fukushima in Japan, we've got Chernobyl in Russia, and both of these kind of buzzwords already are enough to strike fear into you, because you know that you know what happened there. There was these disasters where loads of radiation flooded out into the environment and affected people's health. So I think if we do pursue nuclear energy, which we are mainly around the world, then it's kind of inevitable that there are going to be mistakes, because there are mistakes with everything. So that is something to think about. You know, it's inevitable that there will be another disaster, but it's impossible to tell where or when that might be. And of course, when lots of people hear about atomic things or nuclear things, the first thing they actually think about is nuclear weapons, so nukes. So when you hear the word nukes, you might think of a nuclear bomb going off. And of course, as much as nuclear physicists and those who work in power stations might not like this, the two are actually very closely tied together. So you can't really develop a nuclear bomb or missile without having all of the knowledge and infrastructure already there to have a nuclear power station in operation. So by building the power station, you're kind of enabling the missile to be built. And that's one of the ugly truths about nuclear energy, really. The fact that it's so closely tied to these weapons of mass destruction that can kill millions of people and wipe out entire cities. So obviously this doesn't really do much to improve the reputation of something like nuclear power. This just ties into the whole image of disaster and death and destruction that we have in our heads sometimes. Personally, I think nuclear energy is scarier. I completely agree there, because it has the potential to, you know, erupt on a massive scale and do a massive amount of damage in a relatively localized area, I feel, where coal power is actually less scary an idea, but personally I think it's more damaging, because we've got them, you know, all over the place. There's far more coal power plants than there are nuclear, and I think, you know, the impacts, at least of nuclear, when it happens, you're aware that there's been a disaster and you can react accordingly. Where with coal, they're pumping out this toxic stuff every day of the week. It doesn't have to go wrong to kill you. Where, you know, a nuclear power station has to have a pretty serious breakdown in some way before it can actually do anyone in the neighborhood harm. So where does the waste actually go? Up until 1993, this is pretty unbelievable. I didn't believe it myself when we actually did the research, but loads of countries were actually just taking their nuclear waste, taking it to the seaside or the coast and just dumping it straight in there in the ocean. So I don't really need to explain why that's a bad idea, but I'm pretty sure you'll be getting some 3-headed fish if you do that for too long. So yeah, not a great idea there. All of the high-level radioactive stuff, the really, really dangerous stuff that will fry you in the blink of an eye, is actually buried most of the time in really, really deep underground vaults. So these are specially created kind of bunkers where there's massively thick concrete shielding it from the outside world. And they fill the radiation, the radioactive waste, they fill these kind of like barrels with it, and then roll them in there, seal it up, and hopefully never see it again. So it takes tens of thousands of years for that nuclear waste to actually become safe to handle. So we build these bunkers underground really, really strong, so no one can get to them, basically. And they even have signs on, actually. It's quite interesting. We have signs on the front of these underground vaults, and it's designed to be read by anyone, including kind of cavemen in the future, so that they don't open it, because the waste would still be really harmful in there a few thousand years from now. We've actually put kind of like stickman drawings on the door of the vaults and other symbols to show that going in there is a bad idea. and it'll probably get you killed. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty important sign. I think that's a sign right there that, you know, if we are going to pursue nuclear energy, which we are because we're building Hinkley Point C, if we're going to keep going down that track, one of the most important things to do is actually make sure we have the infrastructure to deal with the waste ahead of time, because you can't really just build this old building and chuck the waste in there and pretend it's not a problem, because it is a problem. You're going to have to deal with it one day, and it's getting more and more expensive to do that as time goes on. Personally, I think a lot of the risks are actually overblown around nuclear, and they're damaging it because people aren't going to invest in a nuclear power station if it's controversial, and they're going to get protesters, you know, standing in the road and stopping it being built. And these things, these kind of, you know, wild ideas that we're having, it's fair enough to worry, but I think you need to do the research, look at the things like the death count there, see that it is actually one of the safest forms of energy, and you know, it's not that bad. I think it's a good form of power. You know, Donald Trump's out there saying that wind turbines cause cancer.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations, your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You told me that one, okay?
So there's a load of crap basically floating around about anything if you choose to believe it. So people need to look at these death counts and the actual safety statistics coming from the World Health Organization, which is pretty reputable, and make up their minds for themselves based on that, and see that nuclear is actually quite safe in comparison to coal, gas, and these other forms of electricity. At the very least, I think it's a good solution for the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, because at the moment we don't really have that many alternatives, you know. Even if you don't like it, it's the lesser of the evils that we have available, the lesser of two evils. Because you've got coal, we know that's causing climate change with the other fossil fuels. You've got renewables, which are great, but we're not really in a place where we can rely on them 100%, because they still need more investment, more development, and they need to be linked with batteries, which aren't necessarily there yet and technologically. And nuclear power, I think, is kind of a compromise in the middle where, you know, it still creates some bad stuff, but not as bad as the bad stuff we get from fossil fuels. It's relatively clean, not as clean as renewables. But generally speaking, I think for a few hundred years, it's the perfect energy source, and we should rely on that until we can go 100% renewable. That's my opinion of nuclear power. I support it. I think it's much better than fossil fuel generation like coal or gas. But then again, that's easy for me to say. I don't have one near my house. You know, maybe in the future I will. Let me know if you do. Let me know if you live near a power station powered by nuclear energy and uranium. Whether you and your family are safe or whether your children are now glow in the dark, please let us know. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and see you next time on Bork. Whatever your opinion about nuclear energy, whether it's destroying the planet or saving the human race, please give us a like and make sure you tune in next time for more from Bork. Thank you.